There was once a time when I was interviewing for social studies jobs, and someone almost gave me a job teaching economics, and that would have been the greatest travesty that ever happened to those kids. So if you really want to know the story of the stock market crash, you can look it up on the internet, or you can talk to any of our great econ teachers here. But I'm going to do my best to not screw this up too badly. And basically, when we're talking about the end of the 1920s, we're talking about the how, when, and why, that the roaring 20s that we talked about, how this bubble burst. Now, we know all about how the 20s saw a great increase in products like the car, construction, even radio. But the big bubble was created by people thinking that if they purchased shares in the stock market, it would go up and up and up and up. And there were economists throughout the 20s who said, you know what? This will continue to happen because our economy is just so strong. Now, as we talked about on Monday, investors purchased stocks on margin where they weren't putting all the money down. So the example that we used in class was if a share was $100, which it wouldn't have been, that's way too much, but I put down $20, the broker would put up most of the risk and put $80. But the broker didn't worry about that risk because the market kept going up and they knew that they were going to get paid. Now, stock trading became one of America's great pastimes, like we saw many of them in the 1920s. And to the little guy investor that we saw in the political cartoons, stocks were practically the best option, a sure thing. Very few of these investors studied finances or the actual sort of foundations of the businesses that they were invested in. No one thought a crash was possible because they all thought the stock market was just going to continue to rise. Now, by 1929, which is the fateful year, the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, which we remember was created by Woodrow Wilson during his progressive presidency, they raised interest rates. And now I'm not going to explain exactly what that all means, but their goal was to try to cool down the economy, to try to make sure that people weren't being as speculative, okay? Now, in October of 29, which again is the fateful month of the fateful year, people started to worry about the economy and particularly the market. So again, as we saw with panics in 1819 and 1837 and 57 and 1873 and 1893, please, ATF and Beast Mode, please don't run to the door when you hear this, but people were panicking, okay? Again, a panic is where people get worried and they try to get their money out of banks. In this case, people weren't trying to get their money out of banks. Originally, they were trying to get their money out of the stock market before the bottom fell out. Now, margin investors, remember, those are the people that didn't put up all the money at the beginning. As the price starts to go down, they're starting to get really, really worried because when they liquidate their shares, that means when they try to sell their shares off, they're losing money. Okay, it wasn't just a little guy. Millionaires lost a ton of money as well. So in just 3 days, you're going to see $5 billion worth of the market go away. And by the end of the crash overall, over a couple of weeks, you're going to see $16 billion lost. Now, that could be the end of the story, but it's not, because many banks had actually invested in the stock market themselves. So remember, banks have people's savings in them, but at the same time, they not only have savings that they're just keeping in there, they're actually investing across the economy. So people are getting very, very worried about their money. So you're going to have bank runs where people weren't just trying to get their money out of the market, stock market, they're trying to get their money out of banks. Banks are going to go essentially bankrupt, and the entire financial system is in shambles. And so we're going to get into the next part of the story, which is how do individuals deal with this, and then how does the federal government, specifically Herbert Hoover, deal with this absolutely catastrophic financial condition. So when we look at the impact on the American people, we've got to think about what happens in terms of jobs, because that's the major impact. So without banks being able to invest in the economy, businesses have to cut back on their employees. When businesses cut back on their employees, these employees don't have as much to spend. So when they don't have as much to spend, businesses, again, don't have as many employees. So it's this cycle. So if people are laid off, they can't buy stuff. And if they're not buying stuff, companies don't need as many employees. So we need to figure out, as we get to FDR in the sort of chapter 27, which we're going to start tomorrow, what does he do first? Well, he wants to make sure that banks are back on their feet and people get jobs. Now, part of the problem is that Europe is really struggling as well. And again, we saw this in terms of the fact that the United States didn't make a huge effort to help Europe get back on its feet. You throw in the Smoot-Hawley or Hawley-Smoot tariff, and then you've got the whole idea that trade isn't really happening internationally. So again, you have conditions internally in the market, then you have external conditions with other countries, and the economy is just not doing well at all. Okay. Now, when we look at beyond sort of the job idea, we have to think about what this is actually doing to the psyche of the American public. And in terms of the just kind of unbelievable numbers of unemployment, we can look at the Northeast and the Midwest, and we can see types of numbers where it's like in Cleveland, 1 out of every 2 people is unemployed. In Toledo, Ohio, 8 out of every 10 people. And so you say, well, of course they would want to seek help because they need to feed their families. But we got to go back to that whole idea of rugged individualism that's sort of always permeated throughout America, and that you do it on your own, you sink or swim on your own. And so you're actually going to see abnormally high suicide rates from people who are so embarrassed and ashamed by their condition. Now, there's an interesting part of all of this, which is that, men who thought it was always their job to take care of their families felt like they couldn't do it. And in some ways they were emasculated. And you're actually going to see divorce rates decrease. And you're like, well, that's odd. Wouldn't men have sort of been so embarrassed that they left their families? Well, they did leave their families. And many of them became hobos, or people that were homeward bound just looking for job opportunities. But divorce was actually expensive. So you didn't get divorced. You just saw families being shattered because either fathers were committing suicide or fathers were leaving. Now, I'm not saying this happened to everybody, by no means, but we saw a higher incidence of this in the late 20s and 30s than we saw at any other time. Now, one area that was particularly hit hard, and it had nothing to do with the stock market, but it had to do with the way that people had been farming, going back all the way to the days of the sort of the Homestead Act, where they found that much of the land really couldn't be treated the way that other parts of the country were. It wasn't as fertile and it wasn't as verdant. So what people had actually done is something called dry farming, where they actually just sort of pulverized the topsoil. And again, I'm not going to get into real agricultural specifics, but part of this is that it created very loose soil towards the top. And so you're going to get these sort of nightmarish conditions where these sort of CGI-like windstorms come through, blowing off the topsoil. And we're talking hundreds of miles. We're talking the type of dust storms that could kill crops, could bury farm equipment under it, and you're going to have dust blowing through doors, through windows, and then you got to add on this crazy, like 10 plagues grasshopper infestation that were not only eating crops, but could like go through clotheslines and through fence posts. And so we're actually going to see people leaving the Dust Bowl, Oklahoma and Arkansas, and heading west, as exemplified by the book Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck with the Joad family, and that's why Otis is called Okie. It's a long story there. But the question then is, like, could Herbert Hoover, this mining engineer, this man who'd really encouraged Americans to sacrifice during World War I, who became Secretary of Commerce, could he have done something? Now, I told you on Monday that he actually did more than any president had ever done during financial instability. Now, one act he took was to help farmers. And remember, farmers were really the one group that was struggling in particular during the 1920s. And he created something called the Agricultural Marketing Act. Now, I want to dispel sort of a misconception that Tyndall laid out. They used the term farming cooperatives, which you guys might have said, like, oh, co-ops, just like the Grange. No, these were not farmers coming together. These were organizations that were created to, quote-unquote, help farmers. But you have to understand they were sort of between the federal government and the farmers. And the Agricultural Marketing Act was designed to give money to these cooperatives who would then make loans to farmers, okay? And they would buy up crops to, again, stabilize prices, because if you get, crop supply out of there, then you can actually have higher prices. Remember, it was supply and demand. But the part that you have to understand is no money went directly to farmers. So farmers still felt like they weren't getting help from the federal government because they actually weren't getting directly helped. So you got the farming piece, which is, again, sort of a trickle-down, incorrect or indirect way of helping farmers. But then you have a bigger effort called the RFC, or the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which in and of itself was a huge effort, $2 billion. But those $2 billion weren't going to the unemployed. They were actually going to banks and insurance companies. And the goal there was that they would then invest in the economy and help people out. Now, again, their money wasn't going directly, it was indirect, it was trickle down. It was supposed to help businesses who could then hire more people, which could then really spur the economy. But much of that money never actually trickled down. Much of that money was not even actually invested. So while businesses and insurance companies and even these sort of farm cooperatives got money, the little guy always felt like Herbert Hoover did not care about him. Now, Herbert Hoover didn't help the situation because he seemed to always be saying sort of what seemed delusional, and he'd say stuff like, "I'm convinced that the worst has passed and we're going to be okay." And Americans are struggling, and they're saying, "How can you possibly say that? You have the power to help us directly, but you're not. It seems that you're giving money to your cronies, sort of big business, that's never getting to us." And if you've seen Annie, sort of famously, "We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover." Like, we're living in these Hoovervilles, these homeless encampments. We've got Hoover leather, which is cardboard boxes. We've got Hoover wagons, which are cars without wheels being pulled by horses. It was this great contempt for Herbert Hoover, who, was saying prosperity's right around the corner, and you know what? We're not getting it. And then there was one group in particular who said, you know what? We're going to make our demands heard. And those are people that are veterans of World War I. Now, what's interesting was in 1924, they were promised a payment, but that payment was not going to come for 19 years. To 1945. So basically, at that point, we'll really give you an extra reward for your services. Well, people in the early 30s are saying, wait a sec, we can't wait till 1945. So you've got like 20,000 veterans and a bunch of other unemployed people who go to the nation's capital in D.C., and they're trying to get this bonus 13 years early. And they live in these Hoovervilles, again, these sort of homeless encampments, and they're lobbying Congress. And the House actually says, yeah, we'll do this, but the Senate doesn't. And so they're defeated. Now, a number of them stayed in D.C., and they were sort of living and loitering and in some ways squatting in empty buildings. And so Hoover says, we've got to deal with this. And they actually go to a place called Anacostia Flats in Maryland. And under the orders of the federal government, but with the U.S. Army, they burn them out of the camps. Now, this was seen as, by the Americans, incredibly insensitive. You've got people that are just trying to get money, albeit money that was not due to them for over a decade, but this is the way they're being treated by this insensitive federal government. So all of these conditions that we're going to see, people not feeling like they got help, despite the fact that Herbert Hoover had done more than any president before him, lead to the election of 1932, where Herbert Hoover is a dead man walking. And you're going to have FDR coming out of New York saying, we're going to do anything and everything we can, despite the fact that it was a rather unspecific set of policies. But he's going to defeat Hoover, and we're going to see really the beginning of the New Deal.